here. They hit us about an hour ago. The others coming?
Yeah, shouldn't take long. They're coming in.
If given the choice, capture by Indians to be tortured to death or commit suicide, which would you decide? For the men and women at this site 160 years ago, the question was not an academic one, but one of reality.
Hello, viewers. I have a rhetorical question for you. What inspired the Western writers of fiction, Western fiction, in the late 19th century, early 1900s? And what inspired the cinema writers in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s to come up with the plots for their Westerns? Surprisingly, many of these plots are based on actual events. The writers took the event, fictionalized it, expanded it, glorified it, and ended up producing a Western genre which was going to influence generations of Americans for decades. Okay, I am today at the site of one of those events. We always think about the classic Western. The wagon train is surrounded by the Indians. They're firing into it. As the day progresses, you see the center of the wagon train filled with dead and wounded. The Indians are pressing on.
Over here now! Right up, man! Custer! Yell when you see them coming!
There appears to be no help. The hero grabs the heroine, pulls her to him, places his pistol by her head so that she will not be captured by the vicious savages. And what happens? The cavalry arrives just in time. And this is what happened here on this hill behind me.
The story begins on July 20th, 1866, when a group of about 30 men, women, and children left Fort Reno to travel to Fort Phil Kearny along the dangerous Bozeman Trail. The party was made up of 5 lieutenants, 10 enlisted men, 9 teamsters, an Army chaplain, an Army surgeon, 3 women, 2 children, and 3 civilians. One of the civilians was a photographer, Ridgway Glover. They were reinforcements to Fort Phil Kearny's garrison. The commander at Fort Reno was reluctant to allow the party to continue on because of increased hostile Indian activity. Realizing, however, that all the officers and most of the enlisted men had Civil War combat experience, he allowed them to continue. On the morning of July the 20th, the detachment marched out under the command of Lieutenant Templeton. The following day, July 21st, the group had an ominous warning. In a dry creek bed, they found the scalped and mutilated body of a white man, probably that of a soldier. After burying the body, the train moved on. Lieutenant Daniels and Templeton were riding ahead, acting as scouts. As the officers approached the crossing on the Crazy Woman Creek, they saw several dark objects on the hill beyond the creek. Identifying the objects as buffalo, the officers alerted the train and stated they would attempt to push the herd towards the wagons and in rifle range. They then galloped towards the bison and out of sight. Shortly after, the wagons dropped down the hill into the sandy creek bed. The mules struggled, pulling the wagons through the sandy creek bottom. The Lakota, lying in ambush, attacked. In the words of an eyewitness, the entire detachment was in a dry river bed, urging the teams through the sands, when to our complete astonishment, a volley of arrow and rifle shots were poured into us. The shots were accompanied with a chorus of savage yells, and the timber, land, and bush above and about us was fairly alive with Indians. Crazy Woman Creek is along the trails. The Bozeman Trail is in the upper left-hand corner of the shot. Because the men had their guns ready for the expected buffalo, they were able to return fire instantly, and no one was hurt. A dozen men charged up the creek bank ahead of the wagons and drove the Lakota back into the trees and brush along the creek. The teamsters drove the wagons out of the sandy creek bed and onto the top of the bank, where they formed a corral. Because the corral was completely closed, the Sioux made another charge, which was driven back also. 2 men and 2 mules, however, were wounded. Shortly following this attack, Lieutenant Daniel's riderless horse, with arrows in its neck and side and saddle twisted under its belly, fled from the brush. The horse was quickly followed by Lieutenant Stapleton, slumped over his saddle with a head wound and an arrow in his back and several in his horse. He made it to the corral and either fell or was helped off his horse. The record is not clear. The lieutenant was placed in a wagon and the surgeon removed the arrow, but before he could dress the wound, had to return to the defense line as the Lakota were making another attack, which was also repelled. With Lieutenant Stapleton wounded, Lieutenant Wans assumed command. An experienced Civil War veteran, Wans realized the wagon's corral was an untenable position. The Sioux, sheltered by the brush and in a more elevated position, had the tactical advantage. They could remain under cover and pick off the soldiers and animals one by one. A half-mile away was a high treeless knoll. From there, the soldiers could hold out until dark. The change of position would be dangerous, but necessary if there was any chance of survival. The wagons were organized for a run. 2 wagons would lead. The ambulances with the women and children would follow, and the remaining 3 wagons would cover the rear. 7 men would form a rear guard, and 12 men would cover the flanks and the advance. The teamsters whipped the mules into a gallop and raced for the knoll, and race it was. The Lakota quickly realized the purpose of the movement, and a party of warriors burst from the creek bed and attempted to reach the knoll first. The Indians lost, but 2 more soldiers were wounded. The original position of the wagon train was just beyond the tree line. The wagons then moved, paralleling the creek. They reached the knoll to the left of the ravine. Wagons were again formed into a square, and rifle pits dug just outside the corral. Often, if given the opportunity, defenders of wagons would dig rifle pits in front of the wagons, not always hunkering behind boxes and wagon wheels as seen in old Western movies. Individual warriors would make dare rides around the wagons, shielding themselves behind their ponies. Twice more, the warriors made a mass charge, but were driven back. It was at this time photographer Glover attempted to set up his camera to record the battle. Lieutenant Wands knocked him down and handed him a rifle instead. The situation seemingly developed into a standoff when out of nowhere a hail of arrows came in from the left of the corral, wounding 3 men. The arrows came again, and it was soon deduced that the warriors had slipped into range from a narrow ravine that cut up from the creek. Chaplain White, wounded by one of the arrows, and a trooper volunteered to clean out the ravine. They dropped into the ravine, and with heavy gunfire and war screams of their own, drove the Lakota from the ravine, and then dug a rifle pit on the bluffs above to keep the ravine clear of attackers. Day wore on, and the water supply ran out. All were suffering from thirst, but especially the children and the wounded. One of the officers and an enlisted man collected all the canteens. Under covering fire, they made for the creek. The Sioux, ignoring the water party, dashed for the wagons, but were driven back. The water party successfully returned. Refreshed with water, some of the wounded were able to add their numbers to the defensive firing line. None too soon. The war party made 2 more attacks on the wagons, but again were driven back. 1 sergeant was killed and 3 more wounded, however. The situation for the defenders, however, was dire. Half the men were out of action, 2 dead and many wounded, some seriously. One of the soldiers recounted, "Our situation was now becoming desperate." As daylight was fading, a council of war was held. At the gathering, the survivors decided that if the situation appeared that they would be overrun by the Indians, they would not be captured. The remaining able-bodied men would mercifully kill the wounded, the women, and the children, and then themselves. The thought of suicide was too much for Chaplain White to accept. He volunteered to ride back to Fort Reno for help. A trooper offered to join him. The 2 remaining uninjured saddle horses were prepared, and each man given a 6-shot revolver. They were halfway across the dry creek bed before the Sioux were aware. Then a group of mounted warriors burst out of the trees and gave chase. The 2 men put spurs to their horses, and soon the riders and their pursuers were out of sight of the besieged wagon train. At that point, the wagon defenders then observed the Lakota gathering for what seemed to be their own council of war. They saw a large cloud of dust to the northwest. Was it more Indians? Was this the end? It appeared the case when a warrior was seen at the top of the knoll waving a flag, and the Indians in the creek began moving about. Were the Sioux preparing for a coordinated attack with the arriving reinforcements? The darkness soon concealed all movement. As the men in the rifle pits awaited the unknown, a picket observed the lone rider approaching the circle of wagons. An officer shouted, "Halt!" "I am a friend," was the reply. "State your name." "Jim Bridger." The besieged party let out a cheer as old Gabe's horse picked its way into the corral. The dust cloud, Bridger explained, was from 2 companies of mounted infantry from Fort Phil Kearny. They were about a half-mile behind him. By the time the relief troops arrived, the Lakota were long gone, vanishing in the dark night of the prairie. The Battle of Crazy Woman Creek was over. The reinforcements camped across the knoll and placed pickets, while the surgeon attended the wounded throughout the night. The next day, Lieutenant Wans headed the wagons back to Fort Reno. A patrol found the scalped and mutilated body of Lieutenant Daniels. No sooner had the detachment started their return march than they encountered the relief party from Fort Reno, led by a tired but alive and safe Chaplain White and Private Wallace. In the last week of July, the wagon train finally arrived at Fort Phil Kearny. The conflict between settlers and Army with the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Lakota along the Bozeman Trail was not over. Future engagements between these groups would be more deadly and more bloody. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you like my work, please hit the like button, subscribe, and